Okay, here we are. This is week 6 already. We're almost to the end, almost to the midterm at this point. I also wanted to say a couple of things about the midterm. I'll be posting it on tonight on the website, and there are different due dates for people taking this on TV and in the live class, so check the website, and the due dates, the proper due dates are on the website. And all the directions for the midterm are on the website. So that's kind of the best place I can leave it right now. This semester, I'm doing a kind of experimental midterm, and so in future years it may change when people who are watching this, so I don't want to really tell you what we're going to do, but we'll see if it works. Okay. I didn't quite finish
Dr.
last
Vaughn?
time. Yes. Yes.
I checked to see if I could get on the website today, and I couldn't.
Uh-huh.
Can I have the website?
Was that the first time you tried to get on the website?
Yep.
And you couldn't get on?
Nope.
Okay, you have to call the helpline. That's 713-743-1411. Is that right? 1411. Yeah.
I had some trouble getting on myself today, but I did get on this afternoon.
I was on for about an hour this afternoon, and I had no problems whatsoever getting on. So that if you had problems this afternoon, there may have been some problems. Last week I couldn't get on at all, and I was really upset about it because I couldn't get on to load the notes on. So it goes down from time to time. But if you can't get on, call that helpline, and they'll help you get on. And the midterm exam will be posted on the website tonight. And if you have questions, email me or our TA. Okay. And ask us whatever you might want to ask about the midterm. That's the best way to leave it at this point. Okay. We didn't quite get through last time, and so I wanted to kind of pick up where I left off. I was telling the story of William's control of the kingdom in England as he conquered it. And of course, the conquest of England, 1066, is such a huge, important event that really was earth-shaking to the Normans and everyone in Europe. It was so surprising, and it was quite earth-shaking to the English as well, needless to say. William had to defend himself throughout his entire reign. And he did split his reign between Normandy and England. He traveled back and forth, and sometimes he would be in Normandy and he would be ruling the duchy there, and sometimes he would be in England while he was in Normandy. Usually Odo of Bayeux or Lanfranc, the Archbishop of Canterbury, would take over and run the government for him. But he would spend months and sometimes years in one place or the other. William Fitz-Osborne, who was one of his very strong supporters, who had been really his right-hand man in Normandy, was killed at the Battle of Cassels trying to put down and help with the succession dispute in Flanders. Now, the reason he was interested in going to Flanders, or William would have an interest, is because his wife was the daughter of Baldwin V of Flanders, and when Baldwin V died, her two brothers went into a civil war over the inheritance. And so naturally, William wanted to have a say in who was going to be Count of Flanders, because the Count of Flanders was his close ally. As it happened, the brother who he was against, Robert the Frisian, was the one who actually gained Flanders, and so Flanders then transformed from an ally into an enemy for England. In 1072, William led a fleet against Scotland, and at that point, when you look at the map of England and Scotland, and you think of it, I'm going to go to that map right now. At that time, here is Scotland and here is England, and you think of this territory right here, which is the Pennine Mountains, and this is Northumbria. And you think of that as part of England because it's part of England today, but it was not part of England necessarily at that time. It wasn't clear to anyone whether it belonged to Scotland or whether it belonged to England, and that's why Malcolm of Scotland kept invading. He wasn't invading England. From his point of view, he was taking land that was really his. And so William, then, I mean, we're getting the English point of view that the Scots are invading, but they're not invading. I mean, they're defending their territory from their point of view. What have I done?
No, just keep going.
Oh, okay. Okay, did you have a question?
Edgar seems to have given it to the Scottish.
The Northumbria?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back and forth. It goes back and forth. And the earls who ruled that area, their loyalties are torn in both directions. But from the English perspective, and as you read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Chronicle will say that Malcolm invades England. But the reality was, it's not clear who that area belongs to, Northumberland, or whether it's independent. It used to be one of the kingdoms of the Old English territory. So William led a fleet against Scotland, and Malcolm then became William's vassal at that time. He appears to have done homage to Robert Curthose rather than to William, and this is a ploy that William used constantly all the time. William himself never did homage to the King of France after he was King of England, nor did he do homage for Maine or any of the territories that he conquered. He always had his son Robert Curthose do homage for him. In this case, he had Malcolm of Scotland do homage to Robert Curthose, and we can read some interesting things into that. First of all, we can ask the question, does this mean that William intended at that date for Robert Curthose to be King of England? Because Malcolm really did homage to Robert Curthose. And secondly, we can ask the question, did he have Malcolm do homage to Robert Curthose in order to sort of make it softer, that it wouldn't be so glaring a surrender to the King of England? Because the implication is that Scotland is the vassal state of England, and the King of England has control over Scotland and over the King of Scotland. So these are the implications of the fact that homage was done. Yeah, question?
But wouldn't it be almost more insulting to Scotland for them to be vassal to somebody who isn't a king? I mean, to be vassal to somebody who's lesser than, I mean, yes, he's the son of the king, but he's of a lesser, station because he's not the king. So wouldn't it almost be more insulting to be the vassal of somebody of a lesser position?
Yes, but Robert was not Robert was not Duke of Normandy at that time, and he was not King of England. He wasn't anybody.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So, you're making the King of Scotland vassal nobody.
No, it wouldn't be, because Robert was so weak that it would be a homage that could be almost ignored, because he wasn't very powerful. And it could be looked at as temporary, whereas homage to the real King of England would be very binding. And so the King of Scotland would find it more attractive to do homage to someone who wouldn't have so much naked power, because he could always sort of blow it off. And I'm sure that's what he was doing, because he invaded a few years later. He invaded England, or Northumbria, which we could say was England. But he did get rid of Edgar Atheling, and Edgar Atheling was a continual threat to William. Edgar Atheling was always claiming the throne because he was the brother of Malcolm of Scotland's wife, Margaret of Scotland. Saint Margaret is who she's called, and so by expelling Edgar Atheling, Malcolm became less of a threat to the English. Clearly he was invading England not to claim it for Scotland, but rather to try to put Edgar Atheling on the throne. So we've got these power struggles going on. I mean, you can see clearly it's a myth that William conquered England in 1 year. No, that's not happening. And now things got even more complicated and difficult to control in the following year, 1073. Gregory VII succeeded Alexander II as Pope. Now, we're going to talk more about Alexander II tonight, but first we're going to recall some things about him. He was friendly to the Normans, and especially the English Normans. He's the one who gave the papal banner to William to conquer England. And the papal banner means that the Pope was recognizing his right as the heir to England. And that was fine with Alexander II because we've already seen that Lanfranc became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Alexander II had been one of Lanfranc's students at the Abbey of Bec. And so they were very close, and they were close and friendly to each other. And Lanfranc was working carefully with Alexander to reform the Church of England, and that's what we'll get to a little bit later tonight, how he reformed the English Church. But Gregory VII was a totally different person. And Gregory VII was a fiery radical reformer. Alexander belonged to that group of what we call moderate reformers who were content to let the various kings be fairly powerful in their kingdoms as long as they cooperated with the church. Gregory VII had a different program of reform. He issued something called the Dictatus Papae, which means the sayings of the Pope. And basically what he was claiming was that kings had to do homage to the Pope as their feudal lord. And he was saying that the Pope was over all the kings of the earth, and even the German emperor. In the past, the German emperors had actually appointed popes. Now, Gregory, of course, had this huge struggle with the German emperors, saying to them, you don't depose popes, we depose emperors. And emperors don't appoint popes, popes appoint emperors. I mean, he was trying to shift the political ground over to making the Pope Lord of the world. Now, if you are a medieval king, your immediate reaction is get rid of this guy, which is exactly what the German emperor did. He said, you're a false monk, you're not a pope at all, and he appointed his own pope, and so there were two popes, and they were rivals. Nowadays, we call the German pope the anti-pope because the reform line eventually won out in the struggle. But at that particular time, it was not clear which of the lines of popes were going to win, the reform popes or the imperial popes. And so Gregory was actually quite a weak pope, and we'll come back to him again as well. He's going to be an actor when we look at the Normans in Italy and Sicily as well. Okay, but let's leave him for a moment and we'll get back to the struggles. William spent most of his time in Normandy after that, but crossed the Channel at intervals. Queen Matilda, Roger of Beaumont, and Odo of Bayeux had acted as regents of Normandy, not Odo of Bayeux. Queen Matilda and Roger of Beaumont had acted as regents in Normandy in his absence. Odo of Bayeux would sometimes be in England and sometimes be in Normandy, and he would at times be the regent. Queen Matilda and Lanfranc often acted as regents in England in his absence. And William's closest associates traveled with him. His household remained the center of government of both Normandy and England. And at that time, even though we think of Rouen being the capital of Normandy, it's the largest city and the oldest city in Normandy, and London being the largest city in England, nevertheless, the kings did not really have a capital city. They traveled around constantly with their courts, and this is just the way it worked. It's like people did not go to them from all corners of the kingdom, although they would come with the king or be at the king's court. But the king moved around to sort of check on what was going on. Well, did he rule an Anglo-Norman empire? And John Le Paterel has claimed that the combination of Normandy and England should rightly be called an Anglo-Norman empire, that it was linked together by custom. The same people were ruling in both places. The same people were in charge. There was constant flow back and forth across the channel. There are ways in which that concept works, that it was an Anglo-Norman empire because it was ruled by the same person. But on the other hand, the governments of Normandy and England were quite separate from each other, and they were alike but separate. And William never integrated the two governments together. In his lifetime, the same people were ruling in both realms. But by the third generation, there were different branches of the family in England and in Normandy. Yeah, question?
On your notes over there, you said that Matilda, is that Queen Matilda, was a regent in Normandy and in England?
Matilda was the regent, Duchess Matilda, as Duchess, she was the regent in Normandy while William was conquering England, and she stayed in Normandy for about 2 years, and she probably was pregnant with her third child, Henry. But then when she crossed to England, and Henry, in fact, was born in England, and this is very important in the history of England, as Henry aspired to be king, that he was the first Norman king to be born in England. And so she did cross, and both of them crossed the channel. I mean, sometimes she would stay in England and he would go to Normandy, and it wasn't the kind of close marriage you think of, but their roles were, they lived quite separate lives. And she had her own court as well as he had his own court. And this is typical of the kings and queens of England as well. So they were what you would call a close family. Okay. William wore his English crown 3 times a year, and that was a Norman innovation. The crown wearings, the great crown wearings, Easter at Winchester, Whitsuntide at Westminster, and Christmas at Gloucester, these were Norman innovations that the Anglo-Saxon kings never did. And why would William do this? Well, it's to display his power and glory as king to everyone in the kingdom, to show his power. And it was an elaborate ceremony where he would be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he would be there would be a mass that would be said that would glorify and praise the king. And so the laudes regii, the laudes regii, which would be the praises of the king, that would be said. And it was just a way of strengthening his power. And the Normans were very into propaganda. I think one of you here is going to do a term paper on Norman propaganda, which will be very interesting. I'm eager to see that. There was another rebellion in England in 1075, handled by Lanfranc, because William was in Normandy at that time, and Lanfranc was left in charge. As Archbishop of Canterbury, he had to take care of civil things as well, or he did take care of civil things. And that rebellion was led by the Bretons of Richmond in Northumbria. By this time, they were Earls of Northumbria, and they were real threats to the kingdom, and Lanfranc just really stomped on them, and he called them Breton dung in one of his letters. And I wanted to show you the letters of Lanfranc, which exist in a collection here. The letters of Lanfranc, edited and translated. They're in Facing Latin and English version. If any of you want to look this up to see what he was doing, you can track his role through these letters. There was another letter that is included in there, which is a letter to Pope Gregory VII, which was in response to a letter that Pope Gregory wrote to Lanfranc, and he said, and Gregory said, we congratulate you on the conquest of England. Now it's time for William to do homage to me as is right, as his rightful lord. And Lanfranc wrote back and said, we have not found in any of the records in England that any of William's predecessors have ever done homage to any of your predecessors, therefore we are not going to do it. And so it turned on a kind of legal argument, but this is always taken as very strange on Lanfranc's part. And why did he turn against the papacy? Well, there are some reasons for that, and when we get to the church, we'll see why. The Laudes Regii, as I said, were praises of the king, ritual chants at Mass, and they had Norman origins. There were Laudes praises said in Normandy, but this was something new in England. So William was introducing a Norman custom. That's something new. It was borrowed by the Normans from the French and the German royal custom. So it wasn't new in Normandy. It wasn't a Norman invention, but it came from other kingdoms. And it also was a glorification of the Duke of Normandy. He was glorifying his role even before he became King of England. William's seal followed the custom of the English, and he had his seal that in the same way that the English did. The Normans didn't have a seal. The Norman dukes did not have a seal, and the seal is a wax circle, and I'll show you one in a moment. I'll point it out to you when I show it to you. But it authenticates documents, and it was only in the reign of Duke William, in his reign, that documents had become really, really prominent in Normandy. They were already very prominent in England. And so that was something that could transfer to England really well. Did William conceive of his realms as separate or unified? There were few signs of the governmental assimilation. William's English charters followed English customs, and the Norman charters followed Norman customs. In fact, when William first went to England and he issued his charters, a lot of them were issued in Anglo-Saxon rather than in Latin. It was only gradually that he began to issue them in Latin. And he always addressed them in a very interesting way. He would address them to all my faithful men, French and English. And he never called his men Normans. He called them French, because remember that he had so many different people with him. He had Flemings, and he had Bretons, and he had men of Maine, and so he had people from all over, and men from Boulogne. So he called them French, and it was always addressed to all my faithful men, French and English, in England. In Normandy, he didn't have quite so grandiose a title, although in the Norman charters, after he conquered England, he never again addressed himself as Duke. He called himself king, even in Normandy, which is quite interesting, because it was as if he left his ducal powers behind, although he exercised them in Normandy, but he never called himself Duke again. He always called himself king. Yeah. Well, you want to press your mic? Yeah.
Seems to have simultaneously expanded his domain within Normandy. He's considering himself as a Frankish or French king.
No.
No?
No, he didn't have a title of a French king, but he was a king. And he was still Duke of Normandy, but now he had control of Brittany and Maine also, but he was not Count of Maine, and he was not Count of Brittany. Nevertheless, he had control of them. In fact, his son was Count of Maine. His son, Robert Curthose, had been named Count of Maine and had done homage to the King of France for Maine.
I thought he did.
Press your mic? Yeah.
I thought that for Maine he had to do. Sorry, I thought for Maine he had to do homage to the Count of Anjou.
No, I don't think he did. The Count of Anjou was out of the picture. The Count of Anjou had died. I mean, the Normans were always fighting the Angevins.
Right. But I remember reading that somewhere one of them had to. I think it was his son that had to be a vassal to the Count of Anjou.
Oh, I wish you'd look that up. Was that in our book from David Bates? Okay. I didn't necessarily run into that myself. so many people are doing homage to so many other people, it's hard to keep them all straight. I thought I recalled him doing it to the King of France for Maine, because remember William the Conqueror, I brought up the idea that, or the question of whether William the Conqueror had actually poisoned the heirs to the county of Maine.
Or am I thinking of Brittany?
You might be thinking of Brittany.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know
Yeah.
one of his counties that he had, either Brittany or Maine. One of the people that he left in charge had to do homage to the Count of Anjou.
I don't think it was his son. I don't think he would have allowed his son to do homage to the Count of Anjou, because that would have been recognizing him as an equal. And William would not do that. First of all, he was a king, and second, he had control of 3 large counties in France: Normandy, Brittany, and Maine. And he would never do homage to the Count of Anjou. Never. I mean, he just wouldn't. I know he wouldn't. Yeah.
It seems like the ducal power was conceived as a little bit higher than the count.
Yes, it was. And it was especially in Normandy. That's a very good question. Because remember in Normandy that William had constituted counts under himself. And so this automatically elevated the office of duke as above counts, and the counts were under him. And so they're very, these Normans are very political. They're very conscious of that kind of political power and the symbolism behind it.
Did Robert do that?
Did Robert as Duke of Normandy?
Did he define the counts under him, or was it William that introduces that?
Well, Robert was a fiasco as Duke of Normandy. We'll get to that next week. That Robert was a fiasco as Duke of Normandy. He really did a bad job. But William used the office of count in a very clever political way. He appointed his relatives. He made alliances and marriage alliances with the counts, and he kept them under his thumb. And then he had that system of vicomtes, who were, you know, in theory, a vicomte is the assistant to a count. But in Normandy, it's different. The vicomte was the agent of the duke who went to the county and checked up on the count and balanced the count's power in the name of the duke. And the vicomtes controlled the ducal castles. So that he was, it's a power game they're playing, and it's in William's reign that it all comes together when he was duke. So I don't know. It's not clear that that William conceived of the realms as separate or unified. But even though the governments were separate, he still could have thought of them as unified. And the idea that he called himself king, I think, sort of points to that. In England, though, he followed a lot of English customs. He followed the English system of minting coins in England, which was another symbol of royal power, because coins are propaganda items. I mean, people cherish coins, especially in those days when a penny was worth a lot of money. For example, the tax on a house in a city in London, a tax on a house in London or in Lincoln or any of the cities would be about 4 pence a year. 4 pennies for the tax on the house for a whole year. So a penny was worth a lot of money, and a coin, and the coins would be hoarded and handled and cherished by these people. And so you put the picture of the king looking very regal, or the king on a horse being a warrior and a protector, and the slogans on it show the power of the king. So minting in England was very advanced, and there were various royal mints all over England, and William just latched onto that system as being really valuable. He professed to follow and continue the laws of King Edward. And actually the laws of King Edward were published during the Norman rule, and there's a new book out on the laws of King Edward by Bruce O'Brien, which, and let me write his name down. What he does in that book is to prove that the laws of King Edward as they exist now were written by the Normans. So, which is quite interesting. I think it's the laws of King Edward. I think that's the name of the book, something like that. And so, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? The Normans are kind of rewriting the laws, but they're claiming that they're the laws of the Anglo-Saxons and they're inheriting Anglo-Saxon power. Yeah.
They didn't exactly set a precedent there that was about 200 years after the fact that the popes came up with this donation of Constantine, forging a document claiming that the Emperor Constantine of Rome had 500 or 600 years earlier given Italy over to the popes.
Sure, yeah. In fact, forgery is so common at this time. We'll run into some more forged documents. Forged documents are everywhere, and when we look at the collections of documents, there's an art and a skill to figuring which ones are forged and which ones are just improved. Because the idea is that if the document was burned up in a fire, say, or it was lost and it should have been saved, well, the document at one time existed and it should have existed. I mean, it guarantees certain rights, so they just make it exist. That's all they do. Yeah, comment.
Well, wouldn't the Anglo-Saxons have noticed that, like, hey, these weren't the laws Edward had?
There were laws issued by Canute, and what the Normans were claiming was that laws were issued by King Edward, and they found them, you know. But they're not exactly a forgery. They're more like improved documents. I mean, and they would do this to monastic charters, like they would add signatures of important people because they should have been there to be on the witness list. But then later we found out that the important person who was added to the charter had died before the charter was issued. And so it's an improved charter, but everything else about the charter is okay. Yeah, comment.
It does seem to have had a role. I mean, he also established the idea of the Danelaw, and
Yes.
seems to have done some foundational work in terms of setting up the government and the autonomy of the Danes and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, this is Edward. This is the laws of King Edward. We're talking about Edward the Confessor.
Oh, okay.
They're the laws of King
Not
Edward.
Edgar.
No, not Edgar. It's Edward the Confessor. But Norman law remains separate, and while we're on the subject of law, I might mention as well that there's a wonderful book by Emily Tabuteau, and let me write her name down. It's on there, okay. According to her, there was an exchange between Normandy and England, and that the laws of Normandy were very fluid before the conquest of England, and that there was this back and forth flow, and so the laws in Normandy only crystallized in the 50 years after the conquest. I don't remember, I'm sorry. But it's on Norman law. It's on Norman law. Yeah. Something like the laws in Normandy. And I should have brought that, but I'll see if I can bring it. But only then did the Norman law crystallize. Here is the seal of William the Conqueror, and I may have shown you this before as a propaganda vehicle. It's very like the coins with his William, King of the English, around here, and here he's seen as a conquering hero. And here is that seal on one of his charters, and this is William, King of the English. This is to the bishops, and William Fitzosborne, the Count, and Hugh, Count of Chester. Okay, so, and all his barons, vicomtes, and all his faithful men, French and English, salute him, or greeting. That's what he's saying in this charter. And then he says, know that I have granted to God and to the monks of St. Mary of, I can't read what that is, and to Abbot Leofwine. And then he goes on with the land grants he's given to the monks. So this is essentially a grant of land, which is what most of the charters are. This is the only charter I have of William the Conqueror that I can show you that's out of copyright. But it's quite typical, and it's very tiny. As you can see, it's very small, and most of these charters are very small. And of course, they're treasured objects and they're collected, although I remember once going to the Huntington Library in Los Angeles where they had a lot of, it's in Pasadena, in California, and they had a lot of collected Norman charters, and this woman kept them in a box tied up with a piece of string. But of course, they're very little, you know, they're very small, but they're not huge documents. They're very small slips of paper, and you can see how small it is and how easy it would be to lose something like this. And so the churches, usually the ones that survive, are documents that the churches have saved. Very few of the lay charters have survived, but a lot of the more political ones, the orders of the king, have survived. Okay, so the charters are a very important thing, and the charters are also they also represent a huge shift that was going on all over Europe at this time. It was really happening, though, in Normandy and England, apparently earlier than in other places. It was happening faster. And this was the shift, what Tom Clancy has called from memory to written record. And that's the name of his book, Tom Clancy, From Memory to Written Record. And he deals specifically with Normandy and England, and especially England, with the written records. And he talks about all the consequences of the shift from an oral culture to a written culture. And this is what was going on in Normandy and England at this time. And here are the shires in England. William left the system of shires, sheriffs, and shire courts and hundred courts intact, and appointed favored Normans and French as sheriffs. And he used the sheriffs in England in the same way that he used the vicomtes in Normandy. He used them as royal representatives in each of the shires of England who reported directly to the king. The English upper aristocracy was replaced by French and Normans, along with most lands and offices. Did Norman settlement resemble a modern colonial power? Well, that's what David Bates says, that the Norman settlement of England resembles a modern colonial power. I guess in that the Normans spread a veneer of their own aristocratic culture over the native peoples. What do you all think about that idea? What do you think?
It seems like William acts more like an Anglo-Saxon king, just an improved version. It seems like England already has traditions of government that are stronger than the Norman background.
You know, I agree with what you're saying, because, I mean, I don't think that he acts like a colonial power at all. I don't think the Normans act like colonials. They don't impose their customs. They try to accommodate the English customs. They claim they're the direct heirs of the English kings, and they try to follow English law.
Just like Canute, it seems like they're just enhancing what is there.
Yeah, that they take it and they reinterpret it, but they try to keep it intact. I don't see them as colonialists at all. I disagree with David Bates on that point. William did use the same group of men to govern England as had governed Normandy, and in fact the same William crossed the Channel back and forth. So did all the other leading men of England, crossing the Channel back and forth. They were the leaders in Normandy and in England, and they were constantly zipping back and forth across the Channel. Even though they were rewarded with massive estates in England, they were very rich men usually, and they had a lot of children and relatives, and they would grant some of the lands. They would be given huge amounts of lands, and they would grant it to their relatives or their vassals. From when you look and cross-check these families and their vassals, you see that people who are vassals in Normandy also are vassals in England. You can see them in Doomsday Book. If you track them down in Normandy and you see them in Doomsday Book, and the same people are governing, and so everybody's going back and forth across the Channel. And in that sense, Le Paterel's idea that this is a cross-channel empire does work if you have the same personnel being in charge. They just operate under different rules in Normandy than they do in England. There were also many newcomers. Yeah.
Earlier, you said that there wasn't much, few signs of governmental assimilation, but you're saying the same people are in charge.
But there's still different systems.
Yeah, I'm saying they're different. Don't forget to press the button. They're different systems. They're different systems, somewhat different in Normandy than in England.
So it's different systems, but all the same people basically.
But the same people are in charge, yes. And so that is one of the reasons
So
Patterell says it's a cross-channel
It's
empire.
essentially the same government, just different rules in each area.
Kind of. If you define government by the people who are ruling, yes. If you define government by the institutions that are predominant, no, they're not the same. Okay?
So there's no attempt made to change the Norman institutions in Normandy to look like Anglo-Saxon England.
Good. No, there's no attempt to change them, although there's this flowing back and forth of customs. And remember that Norman law was very fluid. And so you can see it firming up in some ways that copy things that work in England. And so they sort of creep into Normandy, but it's not done in an official way. There's nobody who's thinking this through and saying, aha, I'm going to devise a new system for Normandy. What happens is, in little things that work in England, they then start to use them in Normandy in small ways, and then the customs are gradually changing, like from the bottom up. Likewise, things that are done in Normandy that work very well are transferred to England, not necessarily in an official way, but in an unofficial way, that these things work and they're used to them and they do them that way. This is true of, for example, the jury. And Charles Homer Haskins has written a very influential article that essentially proves that the jury originated in Normandy, not in England, and that it crossed the channel with the conquest. Although most of the Anglo-Saxon customs and laws are the prominent ones in England, the jury is a Norman institution, and it comes into England. I mean, so there's this subtle interaction between the two sets of customs, but you always have to bear in mind that Normandy is very Scandinavian, and that England is very Scandinavian, and so you can expect the customs to be somewhat similar and easy to blend together, and that's kind of how I'm seeing it. I didn't like David Bates' comment that the massive estates that were granted out in England were grabbed up by greedy social climbers. I think that's absolutely wrong. I mean, that's just a false image that they're greedy social climbers. You know, they fought in the Battle of Hastings in some cases, or they were sons of people who fought, or they were in some way connected with the ducal government, and they were rewarded as loyal followers of the king. They're not greedy social climbers. I just have to disagree with him on that. I think he's not right. Did you have a comment?
Bates just gives a very action-packed account of how things are happening and just goes overboard on that one.
Yeah, maybe he went over. Well, I thought that was going too far. And actually, Robin Fleming called this granting of the lands, the massive granting of the lands that William did, she called the Norman government a kleptocracy. So a kleptocracy, Robin Fleming. Okay.
Is that a modern writer or somebody?
She's a modern writer. She wrote a book called Kings and Lords in Conquest England. And on which side do you think she's on, the Anglo-Saxon or the Norman side in the modern controversy? She sees those rapacious Normans as grabbing everything. So, anyway. William the Conqueror also institutionalized the Danegeld as an annual tax, and this was a Norman in England. In England. Remember, the Danegeld was in England, and it was something that Ethelred paid all the time. But what William did was say, okay, we're going to collect the Danegeld every year. Yes, and the Danegeld, all the machinery was in place, and the hides were assessed with a certain payment. Every hide had a certain payment to the Danegeld. The sheriffs would collect it. It was very efficient to collect the Danegeld all over England. So William said, "Well, this is pretty good. Let's do it every year."
Did he ever institute it in Normandy?
No, he didn't. He never did it in Normandy. And as far as the wealth flowing, the wealth flowed from England to Normandy. The wealth of England poured into Normandy. It's unbelievable how it poured in. And you'll see when we get to the art and the building that takes place in England and in Normandy, how that money poured in. The formula was that in England, the sheriffs would collect 2 shillings per each hide, and I think a shilling was worth 5 pennies, if I remember correctly, or is it 12? 12, okay. And anyway, so that's quite a lot of money, actually. It's quite a lot of money, and so the sheriffs would collect it, and it would all go into the king's treasure. And so this was a ton of money, and most of it went back to Normandy. Yeah.
So there was no taxation in Normandy at all?
Yes, there was taxation, but doesn't this smack to you like an annual income tax? It's kind of like an income tax. There was nothing at all similar in Normandy. All taxes had to do with crimes like murder. The king would collect, or the duke would collect the fines for murder or law breaking, or tolls, or different fines. Usually, it was just different fines, and so the Danegeld, I mean, was something like, I'm sure he thought he died and went to heaven out of this Danegeld to collect every year. Yeah, comment.
Viking raids produced such a situation that it produced a lot of money for the central government afterwards.
Well, I mean, what they did was to generate the idea that one could collect a tax on everybody in the whole country. And William thought that was a wonderful idea. Yeah.
How did the inhabitants of the Danelaw, who hadn't had to pay the Danegeld, now react to having to pay the Danegeld?
Well, by this time, how many hundred years have they been there? They started coming in the 800s and settling there. So now they had been there almost 200 years, and enough generations had passed, so they thought they were English. But they were still rebelling. Remember, I've told you, at a time they're still rebelling against England, against William. They're not settled down, they're not happy, and after William dies, there'll be more rebellions. I mean, there are constant rebellions going on, so they're not happy about it. But remember that William has built castles all over England. I was reading some articles this afternoon, and the estimate is that he built 100 castles in England. I was trying to locate them at one point. I couldn't find them all, but 100 castles to control the countryside, and so he was really having a firm control. Yeah, comment.
The Norman system that you were talking about, of the taxes being collected when there was a murder or something like that, it's very Scandinavian. It's kind of like Weregeld, not Weregeld. Yeah,
Weregeld. Well, yeah, but that's Germanic as well as Scandinavian. It's English as well as Scandinavian. It goes back to the English background.
So the English would also do this if a murder had been committed. They would also pay.
Yes, and the king continued to collect those fines in England for murder or for theft or for various types of crime, robbery, rape, maiming people, and so that they were done in Normandy and they were done in England. They were similar customs that the king could collect. Yeah.
Did they keep the same method of like ranking people? If you killed a woman of childbearing age, you had to pay this much. If she was older, you had to pay this much. If she was unwed, you had to pay this much. And they had this like ranking system, at least in earlier Scandinavia.
They did, and so did all the early Germanic tribes. They had the same kind of thing. It had changed somewhat. It had become more sophisticated, but basically they had those same laws. But the whole society had become more sophisticated. And the first set of laws that was actually written by the Normans is the Leges Henrici Primi, which is written by Henry I in Henry I's reign. And when we come to Henry, we'll talk about those laws because they're very interesting. Yeah.
So the more crimes there are, the more profitable it is for the administration.
The more crimes there are, the more profitable it is for the king. But then if he gets really serious criminals who commit treason, he banishes them from the kingdom, and that's the old Scandinavian custom of exile. Yeah.
I was going to say, especially in, I guess, conquered territories, I would imagine it would be easier to have the villages help patrol their own, because if you have one person who just keeps screwing up in the village and costing the village these monies, they'd pretty much just put him down or make sure he couldn't commit the crimes anymore.
Yeah, we don't have records on the village level at this early time. Most of the records have to do with the aristocrats, and so we figure those out.
But logically it would make sense, you'd think, though.
It would. I would have to, I haven't gone through the Leges Henrici Primi for a while. I have to go back and look at them before I do the lecture on Henry I. They're really quite, nobody has interpreted them satisfactorily. Nobody can agree what they are, whether they're real law or not, in fact. But okay, we're gonna finish this lecture. I have a lot more material than we have time for. Okay, this is a statement that Bates made. The basic structure which supported William's rule in England was almost identical with that of a pre-1066 English king. And you know, I kind of have to agree with that in partially at least, that the basic structure is almost exactly the same, but then what he adds to that is the feudal system. William believed he was Edward the Confessor's legitimate heir, and he behaved much as Canute had as an outsider king. And Harold's reign was consigned to legal oblivion. It was just ignored as if it never existed because he was a usurper, according to the Norman interpretation. But nevertheless, William imposed feudalism on the country, and it was a different system that overlaid the old Anglo-Saxon system. And we'll talk about that a bit later. The biggest symbol of the feudal system that was overlaid on England is the Doomsday Book, which was written from 1087 to 1089, and it was the crowning achievement of William's reign. It was an inquest on the English model, and an inquest is a questioning. That's what inquest means. It's a questioning. It was done in the shire courts by the sheriffs, and it was done on the example of smaller surveys that were done in other places, probably primarily in Canterbury. There's a little doomsday and a Canterbury doomsday that exists. There are a lot of little local surveys, one at Canterbury, and some people think it was Lanfranc's idea. And what they do is to count everything in England, every manor house or farmhouse, every city and every house within the city, every manor, every peasant on the manor, how many peasants were there, how many pigs and cows and chickens were there, how many plows were there, how many fish ponds, how many water mills, how many, we don't have windmills yet, how many plows, how many, what is the rent that it pays, and usually this is called rendering. It renders so many pounds and pence per year. And he did it when the sheriffs asked the questions. They asked for the year 1066, in the year that King Edward was alive and dead. And this is usually shortened as TRE in the Tempus Regii Edwardi. In the time of King Edward, and in TRW in the time of King William. So what we have is a snapshot of the year 1066, and then we have a snapshot of the year 1087. And so that we can see in Doomsday Book exactly how England changed as a result of the conquest.
What does TRE mean?
TRE means Tempus Regii Edwardi, in the time of King Edward, and TRW is in the time of King William. Okay.
Can you spell that, or is it not important?
I'm not sure I can spell the Latin correctly, but let me see. Tempus, I can spell that. I might have the case wrong on that.
It was a snapshot of 1066 and 1087 of what they had and how England grew, or?
Well, not exactly grew, because in some places it regressed. I mean, it had the changes that had been made in those years. And one of the most prominent things you see is that Englishmen were all in charge in the time of King Edward, except in a few places, and Normans were now in charge most other places, but there were still a lot of Englishmen who were still there. And you can see the patterns of landholding that in most of the shires, it was taken shire by shire, and in most of the shires, the king was the largest landholder, and then in that shire there would be a few big landholders, and then under them would be their vassals, and usually they're the same vassals in England that they have in Normandy. You can see that in it. You can see if the income increases. Yeah, what else?
So we can study the changes in some of the large landlords or some of the lords to see who
Yes.
changed
Yes.
in terms of the power structure before and after.
It's a power structure. You can see there's a list of the great landholders in each of the shires. There's also a list of the small landholders, and you can see what Englishmen stayed, and there were a lot of Englishmen who stayed. I mean, all the Englishmen weren't wiped out.
The Godwins probably didn't fare very well.
No, the Godwins were completely wiped out. The Godwins were completely wiped out, yeah. And let's see, what else can you tell from it? You can also see the patterns of landholding that, remember the Godwins held huge chunks of land all over England. Well, William made sure that didn't happen, because to his greatest men who held the most land, he scattered their land all over England, so that the great landholders had a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit up in the north, a little bit way in the south, but none of them, nobody held a huge amount of land who could consolidate it and rebel. And so he was very careful that there would be no more people like the Godwins in England.
So those four earldoms are gone.
The great earldoms are gone, and he did create some new earldoms, though. But I'll talk about the earldoms in a second. But here in Doomsday Book, the Doomsday Book is probably the most important document of the whole Norman conquest. It's a gigantic thing. The 17th century copies is a book like this tall. It's just huge, and actually I saw a copy of it for sale at the conference at Kalamazoo last summer, and if only I had had several $1,000s to spend on these books, but they're really wonderful. Yeah. It does sound apocalyptic, and it is apocalyptic. It's like we pretend it's doomsday, it's the end of the world. We want to know exactly what the count is on this one particular year, as if it were doomsday. As if it were doomsday. But they don't have the feeling like the world is coming to an end. It's just as if it were. Yeah.
The millennial ending has something to do with 1,000 years after the death of Jesus was considered.
No. The millennium has nothing to do with it. No, they're not thinking of the millennium. No, that's the beginning of a new world. It's a new Norman world in England. So it's not the millennium
anyway.
Yeah. but it's just a wonderful book, and there, if you go to the library, you will see literally hundreds of books written about Doomsday Book. You can get a complete translation of it and go through it manor by manor and shire by shire, and yeah, and so you can go through it and you can count it up, and there's been tons of research done on it. It's probably the most important book. Here I wanted to show you a picture of these kinds of Norman manors, a manor or a township held by a lord, and this is what it would look like. And all of them would have the same kinds of features to them. There would be a demesne, a castle or a manor house that would be the center of it. There would always be a church on it. And then the land would be divided up into fields, and everybody would hold an equal amount of land, all the serfs, and some of this would be the lord's land. This is very simplified, of course. The serfs would cultivate their own land for their own profit, but they would have to give a tax to the lord, and the serfs would cultivate the lord's land and give the income to that lord. Everybody had strips here, everybody had strips here of differently fertile land. There would be a village where all the peasants would live. There would always be a mill on the river to grind the grain and saw the lumber and process the leather and the cloth. There would be meadowland that would be land in common for grazing, common pasture up here. There would be waste or untilled land, and there would be, I'm not sure what the close is here, but this is the typical feature of a manor house. Well, here's the church. This would be, you would think of this as being more like a village, but the manor house sort of, and English villages are still like that to this day. I mean, that's kind of what the features that they have. And these are the kinds of manors that would be granted to the Normans as they went to various places. They would have a manor here and a manor there, in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west, in the center, and they would have a collection of manors, and they would have to have their own administrations on each of those manors to farm it for them. Okay, yeah, question?
What's off to the bottom left corner over there?
Over here?
Yeah.
Close. Let's see if it says what the close is. Because I've forgotten what the close is. Well, it doesn't say. You're supposed to know that. If you're English, you know what the close is. Okay, well, maybe one would want to put the camera on me for a minute, and I will shift to a different notebook. And I want to get started on looking at some of these other things. This works very nicely, in fact. This would have been Lecture 10, and it will be Lecture 10 on your notes on the website. The settlement and colonization of England, the creation of the Anglo-Norman state. And I wanted to summarize very briefly what William did, because we've talked in some detail. This is a manuscript that shows an English boat, and this is a 12th century boat. I'm sorry you can't see that a little better. It's a little dark here. But it shows a ship. And even in the 12th century, it looks kind of Viking, doesn't it? If you can see that. Maybe I can zoom in on it, on that ship a little bit. It still looks kind of Viking. And this is 100 years after the Norman conquest. So we still see, this is a 12th century manuscript, as I said. Okay. And here is a nice 12th century manuscript with a lot of warfare and battle going on that I was using to symbolize the Norman conquest here. And here is a king who actually looks very Carolingian, and here are his warriors. It's a battle scene. And here is another 12th century. This is a more typical scene of battle. Oh, that looks nice. When we zoom in on that. A more typical scene of battle. This would have been 100 years later. We still have that look about it that is Norman, though. Notice the chain link mail and the Norman kinds of helmets that they would have had. So this is done in England 100 years later. And this I thought was an interesting thing. Anybody, well, what is it? Anybody know what it is? I'll cover up what the caption says.
Wheel of Fortune?
Yes, very good. A Wheel of Fortune. This is the Wheel of Fortune. And can't you just see the Normans talking about, here is the Wheel of Fortune, and one king who is up on it one day, like Harold Godwinson, is down on it the other day, disposed, and the other king, William the Conqueror, is now at the top of the Wheel of Fortune, and the other kings are below. So this is the concept that we've got.
The ancient Indians had this wheel.
They did. The Romans had this concept as well, and I think the Greeks did too. But it was in Hellenistic Greece, the idea of the Wheel of Fortune was very predominant, especially after Alexander the Great conquered. And so they're thinking along these lines in England. Well, English customs were adopted by the conqueror. The earls, or the ealdormen, they started out as the aldermen, and then they became earls under Canute. And under William, the character of the earls changed drastically. There were English stallers who are about the same as offices in Normandy, and there were a few that were English. Bunday and Ednoth, Robert Fitz-Wemark was a Breton. He kept the Dane Guild and made it annual. He kept the sheriffs, and he kept the Shires, which largely corresponded to the former kingdoms. He returned to the laws of Edward the Confessor, which he called the customs of my predecessor, ignoring the kingship of Harold altogether. He kept especially the chancellor and the scriptorium, who was in charge of the official court documents, the writs and charters. And it was far more developed in England than it was in Normandy. So he kept that English concept. He kept the 100 courts and the shire courts. And as I mentioned before, the jury was probably Norman, or was it Scandinavian? Nobody's really come to the conclusion about that yet. And here is England. England as it was after the conquest. There we have England and Normandy as it was after the conquest. All right. He imposed feudalism on top of the English system. The imposition of feudal institutions over Anglo-Scandinavian institutions. Although there is a book by Richard Abels that argues implicitly that England is organized very much like Normandy, that England is organized very much like Normandy. In fact, Richard Abels argues, without even saying it, that the lord vassal system was easily recognizable in England before the Norman conquest. And it's usually the system with lords and thanes and the granting of bookland. They just had different names in England. So to say that feudalism was an entirely foreign imposition by the Normans is not exactly correct. William granted lands throughout England, but they were scattered and on the spot. He had a council of barons or magnates who were largely the great landholders, who are also called the tenants-in-chief. And this council of barons or magnates is quite similar to the Witan in the way that they gathered around him and advised the king and agreed to things he wanted to do. The earls and the sheriffs were sort of like the counts and the vicomtes or viscounts in Normandy. But no Norman count ever became an earl, and no Norman vicomte ever became a sheriff. So he kept any one man from becoming too powerful. And here we see a 12th century manuscript which shows the king and his men around him. And here we see on the next level again the king and his men around him. So this would represent the court. There.
Would it be best to say then that instead of like the Normans introduced feudalism to England, that perhaps they refined its use? Because the Normans seem to use it in a very different way from the English. They seem to be more savvy with it.
Yeah, I think that would be correct. I think that would be a good statement to make, that they recognized the sameness of the institutions, that they were compatible institutions. Here is a list, and I won't go through all of them, but the people who became the earls. Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, became the Earl of Kent. Geoffrey, Bishop of Coutances, judged many key trials. Robert of Beaumont became Earl of Leicester. His brother, Henry of Beaumont, became Earl of Warwick. William Fitzosbert became briefly Earl of Hereford, but remember he died rather quickly. Hugh of Avranches became Earl of Chester, and so Robert of Montgomery became Earl of Shrewsbury. Waltheof, son of, we had a few English earls, but then they disappeared very quickly because they rebelled, and so he just executed them. Alan the Red of Brittany became the Earl of Richmond, and Roger by God became the Earl of Salisbury. There were no more Earls of Wessex, and that's because Wessex could be thought of as the royal shire which Alfred had come from. There were no more Earls of Mercia. There were Earls of Northumbria. All of these people were marcher earls, defenders of the coasts and borders. And I was trying to make a map here to color in all the places that I could find that, and this is not accurate, but here is Kent, here is Hereford, and this is Shrewsbury and Chester. See them all lined up on the border with Wales. These are Warwick and Leicester, which are defending against what? Northumbria. They're defending against attacks from Northumbria, and this is Northumbria. And I'm not quite sure about this, but I think this is where Richmond was, and they're defending against the Scots. But there, it's not clear whether they're going to ally with the Scots or with the English. And then here is York, right here, where all the invasions are coming from Scandinavia. Notice that there are no earldoms in the Danelaw. No earldoms in the Danelaw, but the rest of them are on the borders. They're marcher earldoms for defense. Okay, so this is the meaning of the earldoms under William the Conqueror. They're no longer large territorial chunks that can be power bases. Rather, they're stationed on the borders to defend against invasion. All right, here is a plan of the city of Chester, which is a frontier fortress, a castle in the earldom of Chester, right along that border, and it's all business. I mean, it's not a trading town, it's not prosperous. It's a castle with a small town around it. It's to defend the frontier. The sheriffs were retained and similar to the vicomtes of Normandy. And again, I'm not going to read all of the people here. There were a few English ones retained. Most of them were Normans who were very trusted men in Normandy, who then became the king's men in England, reporting directly to the king. And all these sheriffs were responsible for the collection of the royal revenues and the executing of royal justice. They controlled the local shire and hundreds courts, and they were keepers of the castle. So the sheriffs were very, very powerful men, and they were quite like the Norman vicomtes in Normandy. And here are the shires again to remind you how many shires there are, and each one had a sheriff who reported to the king. The stallers were replaced by court officers with Norman names, so that's an English name that changed. We have stewards, we have butlers, we have constables who are in charge of the household knights. The steward was...
Hold the map back.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So the stewards were in charge of the kitchen, the butler in charge of the pantry, the constable in charge of the household knights, the chamberlain in charge of the bedchamber. But notice how many chancellors they are. The chancellor is arising to be one of the most important offices, and he has charge of all those monks who are writing the documents, and so now written records become very, very important. And the chancellors, once they do their duty as a chancellor, overseeing that important production of documents, then they are rewarded with the high office of bishop. And this means they're a very important officer of state. Another important office in the Norman government is the camerarius, who is the treasurer, and this is a Norman institution that didn't exist in England before that time. That was the camerarius, who is the treasurer. Okay. The administrative innovations were justiciars, who functioned like viceroys, and the Queen and the Archbishop of Canterbury were usually doing that. There was also a rise of a new aristocracy. Okay, we're going to have to stop here to take our break, but after we take our break, we'll continue with this, and we're working into the rule of the church and how the church changed. And so we'll do that after the break.